The engine hummed a constant, reassuring rhythm beneath me. 200 miles of British motorway, unspooling from the leafy green peace of Richmond, London, towards the industrial heart and hurried pace of Manchester. I kept the window down just enough to let the cool, crisp autumn air rush in, a counterpoint to the anticipation churning warmly in my chest. I couldn't stop smiling. My fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, synchronized with the pop song on the radio. On the passenger seat, my small, structured handbag sat, and within it, tucked inside a rigid cardboard envelope, was the biggest secret I had ever kept. Our secret, our future. The ultrasound photo, 8 weeks old, a tiny, miraculous smudge of gray against the blackness, already demanding my entire universe. I had meticulously planned the surprise. Ethan had been in Manchester for 3 weeks, a critical project launch for his new tech application. He was exhausted, his voice thin and metallic on the phone, always promising, "Don't come up, Chloe. It's chaos. Wait until I'm back, and I'll take you out properly." But I couldn't wait. The news was too big, too joyful, too monumental to be delivered over a crackling mobile line in a brief, rushed evening call. This was it. The moment we moved from being us to being a family. 10 years we had navigated the slow, steady journey of modern marriage. 4 years of dating, 6 years of vows, a shared mortgage, a history of inside jokes, and a mutual understanding built on thousands of small, repeated acts of kindness. We had built a fortress of stability in Richmond. Our next goal was clear: children. Now, that goal was already unfolding, silently, inside me. The sun broke through the clouds, splashing liquid gold across the dashboard. I adjusted the rearview mirror, checking my appearance. A simple navy blue dress, the one he always said, made my eyes look brighter. I was a little pale, perhaps, from the travel and the underlying nervousness of the big reveal. But my eyes were alight with a hope so fierce, it felt almost dangerous. This surprise was my peace offering, a reminder of what truly mattered beyond his hectic work life. I remembered the morning, 6 years ago, when we stood in the registry office. Ethan, sharp in his suit, squeezing my hand so tightly my knuckles went white. He had promised me forever, not in grand, dramatic words, but in the quiet, absolute confidence of his presence. That was Ethan's strength, his unwavering reliability. A man who always finished what he started. A man who, I believed, would never let me down. The motorway signs began to indicate the Manchester city centre. The concrete jungle rose up around me, a stark contrast to the quiet lanes of London I had left behind. My excitement sharpened into a high, trembling energy. I rehearsed the scene in my mind. The knock on the door, the small, slightly flustered surprise on his face, the slow realization as he opened the envelope, and then the joy, the genuine, unadulterated joy that would erase the last 3 weeks of stress from his features. I found the address easily, a gleaming, modern block of corporate apartments, all glass and polished steel, reflecting the blue of the sky. The kind of place meant for temporary, high-level business. I pulled into the underground car park. The air instantly cooled, turning the humidity of the drive into a sterile, anonymous chill. I grabbed my handbag, checking the envelope one last time, feeling its heavy, wonderful promise. The elevator was soundproofed and air-conditioned, smelling faintly of cleaning products and new metal. It played an irritatingly cheerful piece of instrumental music, a ridiculous soundtrack for a moment so profoundly personal. I rode it up to the 7th floor, apartment 704. As I stepped out, the excitement was almost painful. My hand trembled as I reached into my bag for the spare key he had given me months ago. "Just in case of emergency, love," he'd said. This wasn't an emergency, it was the start of everything. I stood before the door. Number 704. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of my heart. This was the exact moment the world changed. I could practically taste the future. I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a quiet, efficient click. I pushed the door inward, just slightly. "Ethan," my voice, usually firm, was barely a whisper, thick with nervous joy. The apartment air was cool, but inside, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't the silence of an empty space. It was the wrong kind of silence. Too deep, too heavy. It sucked the sound out of the air. I took one more step inside, letting the door close softly behind me. And then I saw them, the shoes. On the polished marble floor of the entranceway, next to the small, industrial-style shoe rack. A pair of high, black stilettos. Extremely high. Extremely black. And far too small for me. I wore a size 8. These were a definite size 5. They lay slightly askew, tossed aside with a careless haste that made my stomach drop. My mind, still trying to protect me, flashed a quick, insane rationale. He bought them for me as a surprise, but they were the wrong size. But the lie felt brittle even as I formed it. I never wore stilettos. I preferred comfort, practicality. I stood motionless, staring at the shoes. They were elegant, certainly. They were also utterly foreign. I slowly raised my gaze. On the glass console table, nestled amongst Ethan's keys and some loose change, was a handbag. A small, vibrant red clutch with a delicate gold chain strap. It was stylish, frivolous, and expensive-looking. It was not mine, and then the smell hit me. A thick, cloying perfume. Overly sweet, overly present, vanilla and patchouli. It wasn't just a faint trace. It was saturated in the air. A deliberate, aggressive scent. I loathed vanilla fragrances. Ethan knew that. He always bought me light, citrusy scents. The fragile bubble of happiness I had carried all the way from Richmond dissolved instantly. It left behind a searing, cold void. I gripped the strap of my own bag. The cardboard envelope inside suddenly felt less like a gift and more like a stone. A cold, unbearable weight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to rewind, to take the elevator down and drive back into the sanity of the motorway. To pretend I had never seen the shoes, the bag, or smelled the overwhelming foreign sweetness. But I was frozen. Anchored to the betrayal I hadn't yet seen, only intuited. I knew, with a certainty colder than the climate control, that my fear was justified. It was in that paralyzing moment, when the world was silent and waiting, that I heard it. A sound of hushed, breathless laughter, a small, feminine giggle. It came from the bedroom. The door was not fully shut. The laughter was instantly, violently cut short, as if a hand had clapped over a mouth. A sudden, terrifying silence followed, a silence that confirmed I was heard, and that they were guilty. The journey across the hall became an odyssey. My feet were impossibly heavy, sinking into the carpet. The fear had bypassed my brain and settled directly in my limbs. I felt like I was moving underwater, struggling against an invisible, crushing pressure. I set my bag down next to the red clutch, its presence a defiant declaration of my own history. I walked towards the sound. Word count. 2,752. Ketuk hoi shun. The sun of Manchester was not as brutal as the heat of the road, but it felt colder. It felt like the chill that precedes a thunderstorm. I stood on the threshold, clutching the strap of my handbag, which contained the fragile, profound secret of my pregnancy. The air was thick, with the scent of vanilla and patchouli, the kind of cheap, overpowering sweetness I had always hated, and which Ethan knew I hated. It was a scent that shouted, "I don't care what you think." The sight of the high, black stilettos, size 5, next to the small, bright red clutch bag, was enough. It was a tableau of betrayal, staged perfectly for my arrival. I couldn't move. My mind, usually sharp and quick, seized up like an engine running out of oil. Maybe it's a client. A desperate, pathetic voice whispered inside my head. Maybe it's a colleague from the Manchester office who stayed over after a late night. But colleagues didn't leave high heels and handbags that weren't mine in the hallway. And colleagues didn't giggle in the bedroom. The giggle. It was soft, muffled, and entirely feminine. It cut through the clinical silence of the apartment like a scalpel. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. They had heard me. Or, more accurately, the silence in the apartment had alerted them that someone else was there. The guilty silence that followed was a physical presence, heavier than the oppressive heat I had escaped in the car. My legs felt like columns of cold cement. I moved, not because I chose to, but because some ancient, pre-programmed survival instinct forced my body forward. Each step down the short corridor was a decade of my life slowing down, each breath a painful, shallow drag. I didn't need to push the door. It was slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, the bedroom was a cave of shadows. The blinds were drawn low against the afternoon sun. The vanilla smell was overwhelming now, mixing with something acrid and stale, tobacco smoke. I stopped at the doorway. My heart didn't beat. It hammered, a slow, agonizing drumbeat against my ribs. I watched. The sight didn't shock me so much as it simply confirmed what the shoes had already told me. Ethan. He was sitting on the edge of the large, hotel-style bed, naked from the waist up. His body, familiar to me, was angled away, but I could see the curve of his back, the tension in his shoulders. He was holding a cigarette. The end glowed, faintly orange in the dim light. He had quit 2 years ago. We celebrated that day with a quiet dinner and a shared promise of a healthier future. The smoke curled upwards, a thin, insolent plume of broken faith. He didn't look up immediately. He was focused on the cigarette, flicking a stray ash onto the cream carpet, a careless habit he'd never broken, despite my endless complaints. And then he lifted his head. He saw me. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, were flat, empty. There was no sudden movement of panic, no theatrical grab for the sheets, no attempt to hide the girl. There was only stillness, and in that stillness, a profound, sickening sense of annoyance. He looked at me as if I were a telemarketer who had somehow bypassed the security of his front door. An inconvenience, a distraction. I stared back, unable to process the total lack of guilt in his expression. I was his wife, his partner of 10 years, the woman who was carrying his child. Yet, he looked at me like a stranger who had just disrupted his private, self-indulgent moment. The girl. She was still mostly hidden beneath the tangled white duvet. A mass of dark, glossy hair was spread across the pillow, and one pale, youthful shoulder was visible. It was the shoulder that struck me hardest. Young, smooth, untroubled. The shoulder of someone who had never had to worry about mortgage payments, fertility cycles, or the quiet corrosion of a long-term commitment. The clock on the bedside table, a modern, minimalist digital display, blinked 14:37. A mundane detail in a scene of absolute devastation. I wanted to scream until my lungs collapsed. I wanted to tear the room apart, shred the sheets, smash the glass console, and drive the black stilettos through the window. But the paralysis held me fast. My body had entered a deep state of shock, conserving energy for the long, agonizing retreat. Ethan finally moved. With a sigh that sounded more of weariness than regret, he ground the cigarette butt into a ceramic coffee mug on the nightstand. The sharp, sizzling sound of the extinguishing fire was the loudest noise in the room. He took a moment, dusting his fingers, before he spoke. His voice was hoarse, thick with recent pleasure and now sudden irritation. It wasn't a question, but a low, flat statement that obliterated everything we had built. "Why are you here?" He didn't use my name. Not Chloe, not love, just you. It made me feel less than human, less than a witness. Just an object standing in the way of his routine, he added, his voice dropping another degree into utter coldness. "I wasn't expecting you." That was it. The final cut. The world didn't shatter with a great explosion, but with the quiet, dismissive sound of a tired man being disturbed. It was the ultimate betrayal, not the act itself, but the utter lack of respect for my presence. I felt the weight of the moment pressed down on my stomach. I instinctively wrapped one hand around my lower abdomen, protecting the tiny life inside. The life he had just casually dismissed with his self-absorption. The girl under the covers shifted slightly, letting out a small, nervous whimper, a sound of a young animal caught in a trap. I didn't look at her again. She was irrelevant, a prop in Ethan's selfish drama. My gaze fixed on the ceramic mug, where the cigarette was still smoking slightly. Then, to the floor, where the ash lay on the expensive, hired carpet. I finally moved my hand from my stomach and reached into my bag, pulling out the rigid cardboard envelope. I walked the 2 steps to the nightstand, my movements slow and deliberate, like a dancer in a nightmare. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. The tears were trapped somewhere behind my eyes, frozen solid. I placed the envelope on the nightstand, directly beside the dirty ceramic mug. I made sure the corner of the envelope touched the base of the mug, so he couldn't miss it. The picture inside, the small, gray, hopeful point on the black background, was my only testimony, my silent accusation, my truth against his lie. He looked at the envelope, his brow furrowed slightly, a minimal show of confusion. He reached a hand out toward it, the same hand that had just been holding a cigarette, and probably the girl's skin. But I didn't wait for him to open it. I didn't wait for his reaction, which I knew would be counterfeit, or worse, terrified. I had shown him my truth, my promise, my future. His silence was his answer. I turned my back on the room, on the bed, on the man I thought I knew. My feet carried me back down the corridor, past the red clutch bag and the high heels. They were still there, waiting for their owner to reclaim them. Symbols of the shallow, temporary life Ethan had chosen over the deep, complicated life we had shared. I picked up my own handbag, the weight of the empty space inside where the envelope had been settling heavily on my shoulder. I walked out of apartment 704. I pulled the door shut behind me, not with a slam of anger, but with the quiet click of finality. I was breathing again, but the air felt thin, like I was moving at a high altitude. The elevator descended, playing its insipid, soothing music. It was a terrible, mocking counterpoint to the catastrophic silence that had just occurred. I emerged into the underground car park. The air was cool, smelling of concrete and oil, real smells, honest smells. I got into my car, my little hatchback that smelled of vanilla and leather, my own vanilla, not the patchouli kind. My hands, shaking violently now that the adrenaline was starting to fade, fumbled with the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a comforting, familiar sound. I looked at the dashboard, 200 miles back to London. I hadn't cried, not a single tear. It felt dangerous to cry. If I started, I would never stop. I would dissolve into the asphalt of the car park. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the space, and drove up the ramp into the blinding Manchester afternoon light. I didn't look back at the building. It was already a tomb. The sun felt like a judgment. I drove the first 30 miles in a mechanical daze, my speed unnervingly consistent. I kept one hand firmly pressed against my stomach, a gesture of quiet communication. It's okay. We're leaving. We're safe. The image of the envelope on the nightstand beside the dirty mug was seared into my brain. He would open it, he would see it, and he would realize what his casual selfishness had destroyed. But that thought no longer brought satisfaction, only a deep, profound sadness. His reaction wouldn't matter. The damage was done. The man I loved was a ghost. The man I had driven 200 miles to surprise was merely a careless, selfish man. As I reached the motorway, the sky began to cloud over. A heavy, bruised purple spread across the western horizon. The tears finally came, not a torrent, but a slow, silent flood. They streamed down my face, hot and stinging, hitting the dashboard, soaking the steering wheel. I drove and wept, keeping my gaze fixed on the endless gray ribbon of the M6 motorway unspooling before me. My own life, our future, had just been reduced to ashes in a coffee cup in Manchester. I had left behind not just a husband, but a decade of my life. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just a transgression of the wedding vows. It was a total invalidation of my reality. When I finally crossed back into the familiar sprawl of Greater London, the sun had set and the city lights were blinking on, indifferent to my suffering. I parked the car outside our terraced house in Richmond, our house, bought with 10 years of shared ambition. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine idling softly. I couldn't bring myself to step inside the home that was now contaminated by the truth I carried. I looked down at my hand. The simple gold band of my wedding ring glittered under the street lamp. It was still there, but it felt alien, a shackle, a brand. I reached out and unlocked the front door. The house was cold, empty. I didn't go into the master bedroom. I walked into the living room, collapsing onto the sofa. I finally allowed myself to whisper the truth out loud, into the cold, uncaring air of our shared life. It's over. I turned my back on the man I married. I turned my back on the stranger who sat on that rumpled bed, his cigarette smoke curling around the young, silent girl. My movements were unnervingly precise, born of shock, not strength. I didn't stumble. I didn't run. I walked out of that room, down the corridor, past the red clutch, past the size 5 stilettos, the gaudy evidence of his failure. The door clicked shut behind me. It was a sound too small for the magnitude of the life it had just ended. It was the sound of a latch falling into place, locking me out, locking them in, the sound of a key turning in the lock of my future. I stood outside apartment 704 for a long moment, listening to the silence of the sterile hallway. I half expected the door to open, expected him to follow, to beg, to offer some desperate, worthless explanation. But he didn't. The silence held, absolute and condemning. He wasn't even going to chase the truth I had placed in his hand. I walked to the lift. I pushed the button for the car park. The elevator music started again, a smooth, saccharine melody that felt like a deliberate insult. I wanted to scream at the music, at the polished steel walls, at the utter lack of reality. But I held it all in. I had to. I had a passenger now, a vulnerable, tiny life dependent on my stability. In the coolness of the subterranean garage, I located my car, and it sat there, patient and familiar, a small island of my real life in this foreign, corrupted city. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed my eyes for a single, painful count of 3. Then, I turned the ignition. The engine responded instantly. Reliability, something I could depend on. I backed out of the space and drove up the ramp. The Manchester sun, low now in the mid-afternoon sky, hit the windscreen, blinding and merciless. I blinked, tears finally threatening to break the dam, but I forced them back. Crying meant vulnerability. Crying meant stopping. I couldn't stop. I had 200 miles to drive and a life to protect. The drive was a mechanical act of survival. I navigated the busy streets, found the motorway entrance, and merged into the flow of traffic, all without registering a single thought. My body was operating on autopilot, fueled by a corrosive mix of shock and adrenaline. I kept my speed exactly at the limit. I changed lanes only when necessary. I was a ghost in my own car, watching the landscape of northern England blur into a meaningless stream of green and gray. My hand never left my lower abdomen. It was a silent conversation, a constant reassurance. We are okay. We will be okay. We are going home. The truth was a physical knot in my gut, tightening and releasing with every breath. I didn't dare look at the passenger seat where the envelope had rested. The space was empty now. The message had been delivered, and the answer had been received. I began to replay the scene, not seeking pain, but searching for the clues I had missed. The quiet exhaustion in his voice that was not from work. The sudden need for 3 weeks away, after years of rarely being apart. The way he had avoided my gaze when I spoke of the future, of decorating the nursery. They weren't cracks, they were chasms. And I, the trusting, loyal wife, had simply paved over them with my own desperate optimism. The deepest cut was not the sight of the girl. She was just a placeholder. The deepest cut was the annoyance in Ethan's eyes. The irritation that I had interrupted his ease. He hadn't just broken a vow. He had discarded me. He had invalidated 10 years of shared experience as if it were a cheap subscription he had forgotten to cancel. He didn't view me as his wife, but as a commitment, a burden. The betrayal was complete, total, and utterly without remorse. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in angry shades of bruised purple and orange, the physical reaction started. A deep, bone-aching tremor ran through my arms and legs. My jaw began to ache from clenching. The tears, held back for hours, finally breached the dam. They were silent, scalding hot, streaming down my cheeks, blurring the lines of the motorway. I cried for the death of my marriage. I cried for the decade of love that was now revealed as a decade of illusion. Most of all, I cried for the small, perfect truth in the envelope, now lying on a nightstand in Manchester next to a dirty coffee cup, ignored by the man who was meant to cherish it. That tiny life was now utterly mine. I drove on, hour after hour, past familiar landmarks, past the signs that welcomed me back to the orbit of London. The city lights were a welcome, harsh reality. They were indifferent, unlike the false intimacy of the apartment. They promised anonymity and movement. I finally reached Richmond. Our street, our terraced house, dark and silent under the street lamp glow. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and the sudden absolute silence of the suburban night was deafening. I sat there, breathing shallowly, gripping the steering wheel. I could see my reflection in the dark glass of the window, a pale, haunted stranger. I looked down at my left hand. The simple gold wedding band seemed to burn my skin. It was a lie, a beautiful circular lie. I didn't take it off. Not yet. Taking it off would be an admission that the pain was real, but I knew its purpose was over. It was now just a relic of a life that had ceased to exist 200 miles north. I climbed out of the car. The house keys felt heavy and unfamiliar in my hand. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the cool, dark hallway. The familiar smell of lemon polish and old books, our scent, met me. It felt wrong, contaminated. I didn't go upstairs to the master bedroom. I couldn't bear to see our shared space. I walked straight to the small spare room on the ground floor, which we had always jokingly called the future study. I dropped my bag onto the floor. I stood in the middle of the empty room, and for the first time since I left, I felt a solid, unwavering certainty settle in my chest. The man in Manchester had broken my heart, but the betrayal had also been an extraction, pulling me from a sinking ship of lies. I was free, I was terrified, but I was fiercely, unequivocally free to choose my own path. I gently placed both hands on my abdomen, a gesture of solemn promise to the tiny being within me. This new life, this fierce determination to survive, was the unexpected gift of his infidelity. I whispered into the cold darkness of the room, a promise, not to Ethan, but to my child. We are never looking back. The spare room became my sanctuary. It was a sterile, comforting blank slate, free from the ghosts that haunted the master bedroom upstairs. I couldn't bear the sight of our bed, the space where we had shared promises and intimacies that now felt like elaborate, cruel lies. The scent of Ethan's cologne, his side of the closet, the books we read, all of it was poisoned. I slept on the narrow, uncomfortable futon in the small ground floor study, wrapping myself in a blanket I had retrieved from the linen cupboard. I didn't turn on the heating, preferring the thin, biting chill of the autumn night. The cold felt honest. It was a tangible reflection of the emptiness inside me. I survived the first few days, in a state of meticulous numbness. My life became a series of mechanical actions. I woke up, dressed for my marketing job in the city, and made the commute. At the office, I drafted emails, attended meetings, and spoke in complete sentences. I was a functioning automaton, a sophisticated machine designed to appear normal. No one could see the chasm that had opened up beneath my feet. They saw Chloe Anderson, composed, efficient, slightly quieter than usual. They attributed it to the stress of Ethan's project. When colleagues asked, "How's Ethan? Is he back yet?" I offered polite, non-committal answers. Busy, very busy. The launch is intense. The light tasted like dust in my mouth, but it was necessary. The truth, that my husband was sleeping with a younger woman in a Manchester apartment, and that I had left him without a word, was too vast, too vulgar to share with the polite world. I ate only when my body physically demanded it, mostly dry toast and plain soup. The constant nausea of early pregnancy was compounded by a deep, gnawing disgust. Disgust for Ethan, but also for myself, for the years I had spent loving a mirage. I was carrying his child, the permanent biological evidence of a connection I now wished to sever completely. Yet, the physical sensation of the life growing inside me, the slight tenderness, the fatigue, was the only real thing left. It was an anchor in the storm of unreality. I kept my hand on my belly frequently, a subconscious guard. "We are okay," I told the baby. "He doesn't define us." But the unspoken fear was loud. What if I wasn't enough? What if my own brokenness, my inherited trauma, meant I was destined to raise a child in the shadow of abandonment? My mother. Her memory was a cold, sharp intrusion. My father left when I was 7. He simply packed a bag and drove away, leaving a note that said he couldn't handle the commitment. My mother, a vibrant, intelligent woman, dissolved. The depression that followed was a black hole that swallowed our small home, leaving me to raise myself amidst her silent, weeping grief. I grew up terrified of silence, terrified of promises, and utterly determined to build a life with a man who was the antithesis of my father. Ethan was supposed to be that man, solid, dependable, a rock. I saw now that his stability was merely inertia, and his reliability a mask for profound, internal emptiness. He had broken the commitment, just like my father. And the question that haunted my sleepless nights in the spare room was this my inheritance? Was this tragedy pre-written in my DNA? Was I destined to become my mother, drowning in betrayal, leaving my child to navigate the darkness alone? This fear galvanized me. I would not allow it. My child would not know the quiet devastation I had known. My resolve became an armor, cold and unbreakable. The sadness remained, but beneath it, a new kind of anger began to simmer. A protective, ferocious rage. 3 days after I left Manchester, my 9-week ultrasound appointment arrived. I had scheduled it weeks ago, excited to surprise Ethan with the image. Now, I drove to the clinic alone. The waiting room was filled with couples, women holding their partners' hands, men reading magazines, sharing nervous, excited glances. I sat in a corner, an island of solitude. My wedding ring felt heavy and conspicuous. I wished I could vanish. When the nurse called my name, I stood up quickly, not meeting anyone's eye. The room was dimly lit, warm, clinical. I lay on the examination table, pulling my dress up, revealing the small, still flat expanse of my abdomen. The cold gel was spread across my skin, a shocking contrast to the warmth of the room. The technician, a kind woman with tired eyes, placed the probe on me. "There we go, Chloe," she murmured softly. Let's take a look at your little one." And there it was. Not the vague smudge of 8 weeks, but a clearer, more defined shape. The heart was a frantic, mesmerizing flicker on the screen, a tiny, powerful strobe of life, 175 beats per minute. The technician pointed to the screen. "See that? That's the heart. And over here, you can see the limbs starting to bud. Perfect size. Everything looks exactly as it should." I stared, completely mesmerized. The technical terms faded. The betrayal, the anger, the coldness of the spare room, all of it vanished. There was only this sight, a small, perfect entity, thriving, indifferent to the chaos of the outside world, completely reliant on me. It was the most beautiful, terrifying, and real thing I had ever seen. I reached for the box of tissues, but not for tears of sadness. These were tears of pure, fierce, overwhelming love. The technician printed 2 copies of the image. "One for your husband, I assume?" she asked, her voice gentle. I took the 2 photos. One I carefully tucked into my purse, right against my skin. The other I held for a moment. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "He won't be needing a copy." I looked at the image. It wasn't proof of my heartbreak. It was proof of my future. The child was not a consequence of Ethan's lie, but the sole surviving truth of our broken life. When I returned home, there was a message on my phone. Ethan. He hadn't called since I left. The text was short, blunt, and entirely devoid of emotional substance. I got the envelope. "We need to talk when I'm back. About us and this new situation." The phrasing was clinical. The envelope. Not the news or our child. This new situation. As if the life I was carrying was an administrative error. The anger, which had been simmering, boiled over. It wasn't the volatile, destructive rage I had wanted to unleash in the apartment. It was a cold, surgical fury. He would not reduce my child to a situation. He would not control the narrative. I walked into the kitchen, found our marriage certificate, and dropped it into a drawer, replacing it with the new ultrasound photo on the fridge. I stared at the text message. I typed a reply, then deleted it. He wanted to talk about us. He wanted to manage the fallout. He wanted to minimize his shame. I would not give him the stage. I realized that his return would not be a confrontation, but a conversation of control. He would offer excuses, compromises, perhaps even a staged repentance. I saw the trap clearly, the path back to the quiet, corrosive misery of a life built on his lies and my desperation. It was the same path my mother had walked, accepting crumbs of affection in the hope of stability. I closed my eyes, recalling the image on the screen, the strong, pulsing heartbeat. I would choose the unknown terror of freedom over the predictable comfort of a lie. I put the phone down without replying. I had nothing left to say to the man who viewed the miracle inside me as a new situation. I decided in that moment that I would not wait for his return. I would not allow him to step back into our home and dictate the terms of my pain. This was my life now, our life, and I would be the one to decide the next step. The decision to leave was not a sudden explosion, but a cold, calculated strategy. Ethan wanted to return to a conversation about us, where he could perform his remorse, offer his terms, and force me into the familiar, suffocating dance of reconciliation and slow decay. I would not give him that chance. My mother had been trapped in that cycle for years, hoping for a return to stability that never came. I was not my mother. The first few days were spent in a whirlwind of focused, methodical action. My marketing job provided the necessary structure, allowing me to channel my mental energy into reports and campaigns during the day, preventing the dam of emotion from breaking. But my evenings and weekends were devoted to demolition. I started with the digital sphere. I changed all the shared passwords, bank accounts, utilities, streaming services. It felt small, trivial, yet intensely satisfying. Each click was a severing of a small, invisible thread connecting our lives. I then meticulously reviewed our joint finances. Ethan, being the higher earner, had always managed the investments, but I had access. I moved my personal savings, ensuring a clean, substantial buffer. It wasn't theft, it was self-preservation. I needed a war chest for the battle ahead. The house was the largest, most painful knot. We bought it 5 years ago, a beautiful terraced house in Richmond, exactly what we wanted. It was meant to be the nursery, the family home. Now, every corner felt like a piece of elaborate stage scenery. I couldn't bear to live in it, even if I wanted in the divorce. The walls remembered his lies. I called an estate agent I knew from my professional network, a discreet, efficient woman named Harriet. I explained the situation with chilling brevity. Marital separation, need to sell quickly, private showings only. My husband is currently overseas on business, so I need you to handle everything. Harriet, a seasoned professional, asked no follow-up questions. She understood the language of sudden, brutal endings. Within 48 hours, the house was quietly on the market. I spent a full Saturday clearing out every personal item that wasn't immediately necessary. I avoided the master bedroom, leaving his clothes, his books, and his presents untouched. But I went through the communal spaces, filling boxes with photos, wedding gifts, and memories. Each item I boxed felt like peeling a layer of skin off my soul. I didn't cry. I simply worked, fueled by the relentless, cold energy of resolve. Then came the legal step. I researched divorce lawyers, looking for someone as sharp and unsentimental as a scalpel. I settled on an established firm in central London, booking a preliminary, confidential consultation for the following week. I knew I needed to file first, control the narrative, control the process. My lawyer, a formidable woman named Clara, listened to my story with an expressionless calm that I found immensely comforting. I laid out the facts, the 10 years, the discovery, the pregnancy, and Ethan's clinical text message. "You've been incredibly proactive, Chloe," Clara said, leaning back in her leather chair. "The key is establishing a firm boundary now. You need to file for divorce before he returns, and you need to communicate your terms once, clearly, and finally. We want to avoid a prolonged back and forth." Clara drafted a letter. It was a masterpiece of legal formality, clinical and devastating. It mentioned the grounds for divorce, adultery, the immediate separation of assets, and the demand for the full sale of the property. The critical paragraph, the one I insisted on, was about the child. I took the draft home. I couldn't bring myself to send the lawyer's letter immediately. I needed one last, direct communication from me, not from a legal proxy. I sat on the spare room futon late that night, the cold radiating through the thin mattress. I looked at the 9-week ultrasound photo tucked under the pillow. I finally picked up my phone. Ethan hadn't sent another text, but his presence hung heavy in the silence. I opened a new email window, addressed it to him, and typed. It wasn't a rant or a plea. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who has nothing left to lose. Subject: End of marriage. Ethan, I received your text regarding the envelope and this new situation. There is no us to talk about. The moment I walked into apartment 704 and you looked at me with annoyance, our marriage ended. You didn't just break a vow. You invalidated a decade of shared life and trust. I'm not waiting for your return to engage in a damage control conversation. Effective immediately, I have initiated divorce proceedings based on adultery. You will be served papers shortly after your return. Please direct all further communication regarding financial and legal matters to my legal counsel, Clara Vance at Law Firm Details. Regarding the child, this is not a situation. This is my child. I will be raising this baby. You will be legally informed of the pregnancy and the birth, but your parental involvement will be dictated entirely by my terms and the court, based on what I deem to be in the best interest of the child's stability and safety. Any attempt to contact me outside of legal channels or to involve yourself in my life before the divorce is finalized will be treated as harassment. When you return to Richmond, you will find that the locks have been changed and the house is on the market. You may arrange to collect your personal belongings via Clara Vance. Your keys have been deactivated and will no longer work. Your future is yours to navigate. Mine begins now without you. Chloe. I read the email twice. It was brutal. It was cold. It was necessary. It was the only way to establish the impenetrable boundary I needed. I didn't want his money, his sympathy, or his remorse. I only wanted his absence. I pressed send. The screen flashed a confirmation message. The digital paper was signed. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and found the small key box where we kept spares. I took the remaining house keys, the car key he usually carried, and his office fob. I walked outside to the bin, and with a final, deliberate movement, I dropped them all in. The sound of metal hitting the plastic bottom was sharp and final. I stood there for a moment, in the cool night air, breathing in the scent of wet autumn leaves. The terror was still present, a tight coil in my chest, but it was now mixed with a powerful, intoxicating sense of control. I had chosen action over anguish. I had chosen my child's future over my own comfort. I walked back inside, locked the door behind me, and retreated to the spare room. The house felt huge, empty, but finally, truly, mine again. For the first time since that terrible drive, I slept, not in peace, but in the solid, deep exhaustion of a soldier resting between battles. The war for my independence had just begun. The moment I hit send on that email, a strange, hollow silence descended. It was the calm after the storm, or perhaps the pause before the artillery fire. For a day, nothing happened. Ethan went quiet. The quiet was worse than rage. It meant he was processing the damage, calculating his next move. The response came not to me, but to Clara Vance, my lawyer. It was forwarded to me with a succinct note: "Do not engage, Chloe. Direct reply below." Ethan's email was a predictable cocktail of disbelief, hurt, and tactical outrage. He accused me of being emotionally impulsive, of overreacting to a one-time mistake, and, most gallingly, he immediately leveraged the pregnancy. "You are jeopardizing the stability of our unborn child with this extreme, selfish action." Selfish. The word landed like a physical blow. He, the architect of this ruin, dared to call my act of self-preservation selfish. I reread Clara's instructions. Do not engage. I let the fury simmer, channeling it into the strength to ignore him. Clara handled the response. A clinical reiteration of the adultery grounds, the non-negotiable demand for asset liquidation, and a chilling promise to seek sole custody based on his demonstrated lack of judgment and commitment. The real battleground was the house. Harriet, the estate agent, worked with frightening efficiency. Within days, the schedule for private viewings began. I had to live in the home we had built together while strangers walked through, opening closets and judging the quality of our life. It felt like an autopsy. They weren't just looking at bricks and mortar. They were assessing the facade of a happy marriage. I would hide in the spare room, curled up on the futon, listening to the muffled voices of potential buyers. Excellent potential for a family home. Such a shame to sell, it looks so loved. Each casual comment was a fresh wound. I felt like a museum curator, guarding the exhibits of a life that never truly existed, waiting for the public auction to begin. The scent of vanilla and patchouli, though hundreds of miles away, seemed to linger on the master bedroom duvet. I never went near it. The psychological toll was immense. The numbness I had maintained began to crack. I found myself crying in sudden, violent bursts. In the kitchen while boiling water, in the car at a red light. I wasn't just grieving Ethan. I was mourning the future I had envisioned, the shared parental anxieties, the first shared laugh when the baby arrived, the simple, quiet stability of a two-parent family. All of it was gone, replaced by the terrifying, wide-open uncertainty of doing it alone. The physical symptoms of pregnancy intensified, mocking my inner turmoil. The fatigue was a lead weight, and the morning sickness became an all-day affliction. I was constantly nauseous, constantly tired, constantly on edge. There was no one to bring me tea, no one to rub my back, no one to share the tiny, hopeful details of the growing life inside me. The isolation was absolute. It was the hardest realization. I was truly, fully alone in this. One evening, desperate for a human connection that wasn't legal, I called my closest friend Kate. I offered her the sanitized version. Ethan was having an affair, the marriage was over. Kate, bless her direct, no-nonsense manner, didn't offer sympathy. She offered validation. Honestly, Chloe, it's a bullet dodged. I always felt he resented your success. He hated talking about starting a family, remember? He didn't want a life, he wanted a trophy that stayed on the shelf. Her words resonated with a cold clarity. The resistance, the quiet excuses, the subtle emotional distance, it hadn't been stress, it had been avoidance. He was incapable of the deep, self-sacrificing commitment required for fatherhood and true partnership. The anger turned to cold contempt. He hadn't slipped into an affair. He had actively escaped a life he was too cowardly to confront. His infidelity was not a passionate mistake, but a calculated exit strategy. And in exposing him, I had actually forced him onto his own chosen, shallow path. My focus shifted from the demolition of the past to the construction of the future. I needed a base, a physical anchor that was entirely clean of Ethan's memory. I couldn't afford to rent in Richmond. While the house sale was pending, I started looking in Ealing, a less expensive, leafier suburb west of London, still close to my job, but an entirely different life landscape. I found a small, modern flat on the third floor of a converted Victorian building. It was bright, compact, and completely anonymous. It had one bedroom and a small den that was just large enough to become a nursery. It overlooked a quiet park, a green space of simple, unassuming beauty. When I signed the 12-month lease, I felt the first genuine tremor of hope since Manchester. The flat was tiny, the rent was high, and the futon would have to serve a little longer, but it was mine. No ghosts, no shared history, just 4 walls and 2 futures, mine and the baby's. It was the foundation of my independence. The physical act of preparing to move became the next layer of my armor. I bought boxes, hundreds of them. I started packing my life, meticulously separating my things from Ethan's. His life, untouched in the master suite, felt like heavy, inert clay. My life, packed into neat, labeled boxes, felt light, movable, and ready to soar. I packed the ultrasound photo carefully into the small box of essentials. My passport, my journal, my mother's small silver locket. These were the items that defined the new, independent Chloe. I placed the box in the trunk of my car. I was ready. I was done with the pretense of Richmond. One last glance around the empty hallway of the house. The echoes of a decade of false security whispered back at me. I walked out, pulling the door shut behind me, the new key to the Ealing flat already comforting in my hand. I hadn't filed the full court papers yet, waiting for Ethan's inevitable return to be served directly. But emotionally, legally, and physically, I had severed the knot. My new flat in Ealing was small, but it felt enormous. It was a blank canvas, smelling faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings, a scent utterly devoid of Ethan's cologne or the cloying vanilla of his betrayal. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, not just organizing possessions, but sorting through my past. Every item placed on a shelf in this new space felt like a quiet victory. The futon still served as my bed, a temporary comfort in the tiny den, which I had already mentally designated as the future nursery. The silence here was different from the empty, waiting silence of the Richmond house. This silence was productive. It was a shelter. I could hear the distant sounds of children playing in the park across the street, a mundane, hopeful noise that grounded me in the reality I was fighting for. I realized I hadn't just moved houses. I had moved continents, psychologically. Ethan returned to London late on a Tuesday evening, as expected. I did not track his flight, but Clara, my lawyer, was meticulous. She had arranged for a process server to be waiting near Heathrow, ensuring the papers would be delivered immediately upon his return to the city. The next morning, I received a short, triumphant email from Clara. Service complete. He was served the petition and initial financial disclosure at 21:47 GMT, near his arrival terminal. We await the inevitable response. The response came not to me, but indirectly, an hour later. Kate, my friend, texted. Just got a frantic call from Ethan. He's furious. Said he went home and the locks were changed. He sounded completely unhinged, Chloe. He's calling you selfish and hysterical. I deleted the text without replying. His manufactured outrage was exactly what I had prepared for. The shock of finding himself locked out of his own comfortable, predictable lie was the only honest emotion he was capable of displaying. His official response, drafted by his lawyer, a predictable male advocate who mirrored Ethan's own self-entitlement, was aggressive and immediate. It was a tactical counterattack, a threat to petition the court for full joint custody, immediate access to our shared finances, and a freezing of the house sale. The core argument was a vicious slander. I was acting under extreme emotional distress, making me an unfit primary parent, and my unilateral actions, changing the locks, moving out, proved my instability. The fear, which had been dormant, surfaced with cold intensity. Unfit, the word clawed at my deepest insecurity, the one rooted in my own childhood, watching my mother crumble. What if the court saw my proactive, defensive measures as madness? What if they believed his version of events, that I was the volatile partner who had blown up the relationship over a minor lapse? I called Clara. Her voice was steady, a soothing balm of legal logic. This is posturing, Chloe, textbook defense. He's trying to regain control. We have the upper hand. You left the scene of the adultery, secured a clean new residence, and you have documented his complete emotional absence. He viewed the pregnancy as a situation. You view it as your life. We proceed with the sale and petition for sole parental responsibility. His threats are hollow because his actions have proven he values his freedom over his family. Her confidence stabilized me. I clung to her words like life rafts. His actions have proven he values his freedom over his family. That was the central truth. My child would not have a father who viewed them as a commitment he needed to escape. That evening, I received a direct text from Ethan, bypassing the lawyers. A clear violation of Clara's boundary. "This is insane, Chloe. Call me. We need to talk about the baby. I want to be there. You can't just cut me out." It was the first time he had used the word baby, but it was immediately followed by the phrase, "You can't just cut me out." His motivation was not affection, but entitlement. He saw the child as a chess piece, a way to maintain leverage over me. I looked down at the slight, visible curve of my abdomen. I was 15 weeks now. I could feel a new, powerful resolve, a physical strength that mirrored the life growing within. I knew this was the moment of ultimate surrender, or ultimate definition. I had to deliver the final boundary, not with anger, but with absolute finality, for the sake of the person growing inside me. I typed a reply, slowly, deliberately, choosing every word not for him, but for myself. "Ethan, you were given every opportunity to be a man of commitment. When I arrived in Manchester, you chose a woman you barely knew, and a cigarette over the decade of our life, and the child I was carrying. When you returned to London, you chose lawyers and tactical threats over accepting responsibility. I will not let my child grow up with the same lies I did. My father taught me that a man who leaves a child doesn't deserve the title of parent. You confirmed that lesson yourself. You are not a victim here. You are the catalyst for my freedom. From this moment forward, my life and the life of my child are entirely separate from yours. Do not contact me again. All communication goes through Clara. This is my final word." I pressed send. The message was crisp, final, and true. It was the hardest thing I had ever written. It was the final, irreversible cut. I then blocked his number. I blocked his email. I severed the digital cord, eradicating his presence from my immediate reality. The silence that followed was terrifying, but also clean. It was the sound of my life belonging only to me. I stood up and walked into the small den. It was empty save for the futon, but in my mind, it was already transforming. I started sketching the layout. A small crib by the window, a changing table, a plush rug. I wanted the room to be bright, filled with sunlight and honest joy. I wanted it to be the antithesis of the dark, dishonest atmosphere in which I had grown up. That evening, I drove to a large department store and bought a small, plush bear. Not the cheapest, not the most expensive, but one with a kind, reassuring face. I brought it home, placed it carefully in the corner of the den, and sat beside it on the futon. I looked at the little bear, then down at my belly, and smiled. It was the first honest, untainted smile I had worn since I left Richmond. The betrayal had stolen my past, but it had returned my autonomy. It had given me the clearest path forward, a path where stability was built not on a man's promise, but on a mother's fierce, singular devotion. I was alone, but I was not fragile. I was whole, and I was in control. The future stretched out before me, vast and frightening, but entirely mine to shape. The separation was finalized not in a courthouse drama, but in a quiet, air-conditioned conference room in the West End of London. It felt less like the ending of a decade-long marriage, and more like the dissolution of a minor business partnership. Ethan was not present. He sent his lawyer, a man whose tailored suit seemed to scream entitlement, and an accountant who looked immensely bored. I, too, was represented by Clara Vance, the formidable rock of legal rationality. We sat across a large mahogany table. The house in Richmond, the symbol of our shared failure, was the central topic. Its sale was inevitable, given my refusal to ever set foot in it again, and Ethan's immediate desire to liquidate the assets. The negotiations lasted 3 excruciating hours, all conducted through the sterile language of marital property, equity, and future maintenance. I insisted on only one point, which was non-negotiable: the child's stability. I refused maintenance for myself, taking only my entitled half of the assets. But I demanded a substantial fund be set aside for the baby's future, ring-fenced and managed by a neutral third party. to be used solely for educational and health needs. It was a calculated move. I did not want his day-to-day money, but I wanted his financial responsibility to be permanently institutionalized, ensuring my child's future, even if he disappeared entirely. Ethan's lawyer fought it, citing my aggressive overreach. Clara simply presented the evidence. Ethan's text message calling the baby a situation, and his clear absence since the discovery. His lawyer eventually conceded. The agreement was signed. The knot was officially, legally severed. As I stood up, gathering my papers, Clara stopped me. There is one final item, Chloe. A personal letter. Ethan insisted I hand deliver it to you after the documents were signed. She handed me a thick, folded piece of paper. Not an email, not a text. A handwritten letter. It felt heavy, a relic from a different century. A different man. I took it without looking at her, tucking it into my purse. I didn't want to read it in the clinical coldness of the office. I wanted the privacy of my tiny flat in Ealing, my sanctuary. I thanked Clara, walked out, and took the tube home, feeling lighter than I had in months. Stripped bare, but unbound. In my flat, the aroma of a slow-cooking stew was comforting. I sat on the futon in the den, which was now filled with natural light and the scent of the nearby park. I was 20 weeks along. The slight swell of my belly was undeniable now. A constant, beautiful curve that reminded me of my purpose. I was past the nausea, past the sheer exhaustion. I was entering the strong, nesting phase. I opened Ethan's letter. His familiar handwriting, usually neat and precise, was sprawling and messy, indicating haste, or perhaps genuine distress. Chloe, if you are reading this, the lawyers have done their work. I know nothing I write can undo the damage. I know I destroyed everything we built. I was weak. I was running from the responsibility of the app launch, running from the pressure of the house, and yes, running from the profound reality of becoming a father. I wasn't ready, and I took the cowardly way out. That girl in Manchester was nothing, a cheap, pathetic attempt to feel uncomplicated again. You were right to leave. I was a terrible husband, and I apologize for the decade I wasted of your life. But I am writing this to appeal to you, the woman I truly loved, even if I failed to show it. Please, don't cut me out of the child's life entirely. I know you view my involvement as a threat to their stability, and perhaps it is, but I am their father. I will try to be a good one. I don't want to be the shadow, the absentee father who haunted your childhood. I promise I will not repeat your father's mistake. I am terrified, Chloe, not of the money or the loss of the house. I am terrified of losing the chance to know my child. Please reconsider. When the dust settles, let me see them. Let me prove I can be the man you thought I was. Ethan. I finished reading the letter. The paper was slightly damp where my fingers had rested. I didn't cry. The tears had been bled dry long ago. I felt a cool, analytical detachment. He finally admitted the truth. He ran from commitment. He finally confessed that the other woman was merely a symptom of his internal rot, not the cause of the break. It was, in its own way, the most honest communication we had ever shared. But honesty was now too little, too late. His confession wasn't an act of repentance. It was an act of emotional negotiation. He wanted forgiveness and a clean conscience. He wanted the title of father without having earned the role of parent. He wanted to avoid the shame of becoming the man who abandoned his child. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet park. The air was crisp, the leaves turning deep ochre and red. I gently placed my hand on my belly. I could feel the baby's movements now, small, distinct flutters that were becoming stronger every day. A new life, a new language, a new bond. I realized the critical difference between his father and mine. My father simply left. Ethan was begging to stay, but only to avoid the consequence of his leaving. Neither man was capable of selfless, stable commitment. I picked up my phone and typed a final, short message, sending it not to him, but to Clara Vance. Clara, regarding Ethan's letter. My position remains unchanged. I will inform him of the birth and provide photos at that time, but visitation or involvement will be based on the child's established well-being, not his personal need for absolution. Please communicate that I understand his fear of becoming his father, but I will not allow his fear to dictate my child's reality. I will not let my child grow up with the same lies I did. I put the phone down. The cycle was broken. I had chosen independence over history, and the child's honesty over the father's convenience. The following weekend, I felt an intense need for the sea, the vast, indifferent expanse of nature that mirrors the terrifying beauty of freedom. I drove southeast, toward the coast of East Sussex. I bypassed the tourist towns and drove until I reached the dramatic, chalky cliffs of Seven Sisters, a place where the land ends abruptly and plunges into the turbulent channel waters. I walked along the cliffs, the wind whipping my hair around my face. The sheer scale of the landscape was humbling. I stood at the edge, the vast gray sea stretching out to the horizon. The sun, a pale winter disk, was low in the sky. I looked down at my pregnant belly, a small, warm globe of life amidst the cold, powerful wilderness. The betrayal had felt like the end of the world. Standing here, I understood it was merely the end of a very small, very false room. Tout s'est brisé, ce jour-là, à Manchester. My silent voice echoed the memory of that sterile apartment. The world I built with Ethan shattered into fragments. But as I looked out at the ocean, I found the new words for my soul. Mais certaines ruines font naître des chemins nouveaux. The ruins had birthed a new landscape, harsh but beautiful. And this path will only be ours. I walked back to the car, the harsh, clean sea air filling my lungs. I was not defined by my past pain, but by the fierce, protective love for the life I carried. I was alone, but I was not lost. I was the architect of my own destiny, and it was glorious in its solitude. The sea air from the Seven Sisters cliffs had cleansed the last vestiges of regret. I returned to Ealing with a renewed sense of purpose. The shame was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce pride in my own resilience. The divorce settlement, the sealed letter from Ethan, they were just footnotes to the central chapter of my life, the one that was about to begin. I had traded the false security of a rich man's promise for the absolute certainty of my own worth. My professional life became the second pillar of my stability, second only to the baby. At work, I channeled the relentless, surgical focus I had used in the divorce negotiations. My marketing team was launching a new high-stakes campaign, and I led it with a cool, almost detached efficiency. I was working harder, clearer, and smarter than I ever had during my marriage. Previously, a subconscious part of me had always held back, ensuring I was never too successful, never too busy, so that I could always be available for Ethan's fragile ego and unpredictable schedule. That constraint was gone. The campaign was a massive, undisputed success. We outperformed every projection. 2 months after the initial divorce filing, my CEO called me into his office. He didn't mention the chaos of my private life. He only praised my performance. I was offered a significant promotion, a better title, and a salary that made my financial independence undeniable. I accepted immediately. The success was not just professional validation, it was proof that the woman Ethan had tried to contain was finally unleashed. I was now generating a life and a career that were entirely mine, built from the rubble he had created. My evenings were dedicated to the nursery. The tiny den was transformed from a storage space into a bright, airy refuge. I painted the walls a soft, hopeful yellow. I assembled the crib myself, wrestling with screws and confusing diagrams, a physical manifestation of my refusal to wait for a man's help. I decorated the room with simple wooden toys and framed prints of friendly, fantastical animals. Every stroke of paint, every piece of furniture assembled, felt like an act of protective magic. I imagined the baby lying there, safe and surrounded by the warmth of my singular, uncompromising love. I bought a rocking chair. It was comfortable and oversized, covered in a soft, gray fabric. I would sit there in the evenings, placing a gentle hand on the growing mound of my belly, now unmistakably round and hard. I was 6 months pregnant. The baby was restless, often kicking fiercely when I sat still. I would talk to them, whispering my plans, my fears, and my immense hope. "We are going to be fine," I'd murmur. "We have everything we need right here." My friend Kate became my lifeline. She didn't pry or demand dramatic accounts of the legal battles. She simply provided consistent, warm presence. She came over to help me organize the tiny clothes I had purchased, miniature vests and socks that were overwhelmingly sweet. She was there for the gender reveal, a small, private moment in the Ealing flat. A cake with blue frosting, a boy. I felt a profound, satisfying finality. The legacy I was breaking was the legacy of abandonment. I was going to raise a boy who knew what commitment truly meant, even if it meant commitment to self. The sale of the Richmond house was the final, physical severing. I did not attend the closing. Clara handled the paperwork. When I received the final bank statement confirming the substantial deposit into my account, it felt less like wealth and more like liberation. I used a small portion to pay off the mortgage on my new, tiny flat. The feeling of owning something outright, something completely clean and legally mine, was intoxicating. I was debt-free, Ethan-free, and mortgage-free. I didn't know what Ethan had done with his share or where he was living. I didn't ask. I had effectively deleted him from my operating system. The small, residual regret, the grief for the man I thought I married, was slowly replaced by contempt for the man he truly was. I saw him clearly now, a man incapable of internal truth, dependent on the comfort of a lie, and terrified of the raw, challenging beauty of real life. One quiet Saturday afternoon, while sitting in the rocking chair, I found myself thinking back to my mother. She had never truly recovered from my father's leaving. She had spent her life waiting for an apology, waiting for validation, waiting for the return of a man who was incapable of giving either. I realized my escape from Ethan was not just a breakup. It was a preemptive strike against the same depression that had swallowed her. I was not waiting for validation. I was creating it. I was rewriting my destiny, ensuring that the legacy I passed down was one of strength, not trauma. I picked up the worn silver locket that my mother had given me before she passed, the one I had packed in my essentials box. I held it tightly. I didn't feel sadness, but gratitude. Her pain had taught me the necessity of self-reliance. Ethan's betrayal had been the brutal, necessary push I needed to fulfill that hard-won lesson. The profound irony was clear. His greatest offense had been my greatest gift. My life settled into a powerful, rhythmic flow. Work, doctor's appointments, nesting, and long, peaceful walks in the park. I was not lonely. I was singular. Every choice, every meal, every hour of sleep was made with a focused intention for the two of us. I was no longer an adjunct to someone else's life. I was the primary source, the anchor, the architect. The words of the final agreement, signed by all parties, came back to me. The substantial, ring-fenced fund for the baby's future. It was the only part of Ethan I would allow to exist in our life. His financial obligation, stripped of any emotional complexity or manipulation. He would fund the education. I would provide the heart. A fair division of labor. He had bought my freedom with his betrayal. As I approached the final weeks of the pregnancy, my body felt heavy, powerful, and utterly alien. I was a vessel of life, a force of nature. I took long baths, played soft music, and wrote letters to my unborn son, filling notebooks with promises of an honest, stable, and deeply loved life. I never mentioned his father. The narrative had been edited. Ethan was not a character in this new story. He was merely the prologue. One evening, I sat in the dark nursery, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. I felt a familiar, strong kick, a demanding jolt, that made me laugh out loud. A true, deep, unguarded laugh. I placed my hands on my belly and spoke the message that had become my mantra, the very core of the story I had survived to tell. The betrayal didn't steal my heart, my son. It returned my life, the life I was meant to have. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since leaving Richmond, I felt true, uncomplicated peace. I was ready. The final weeks of pregnancy were a prolonged, meditative stillness. I was 8.5 months along, suspended between the woman I had been and the mother I was about to become. My world had shrunk to the 4 yellow walls of the nursery, the rocking chair, and the rhythmic, powerful kicks of my son. Work had become a distant hum, my maternity leave starting early, a deliberate choice to focus entirely on the imminent arrival. I spent long afternoons in the Ealing Park, walking beneath the bare branches of the ancient oaks, feeling the quiet strength of the earth beneath my feet. I no longer saw couples holding hands and felt a pang of loss. Instead, I saw mothers pushing prams, their faces etched with a combination of exhaustion and profound, self-contained joy. I saw my future reflected in their singular focus. My independence was not a burden, it was a shield, forged in fire. I realized that the true tragedy would have been staying in the poisoned comfort of Richmond, raising this child in the shadow of a father's lie. My relationship with Kate deepened into something sisterly and essential. She wasn't just a friend, she was my appointed co-pilot for the birth. We had gone through birthing classes together, laughing awkwardly at the partners practicing breathing techniques. Kate, utterly unfazed by the medical details, was simply resolute. I'm there for the finish line, Chloe, and I'm bringing good snacks. Her practical, uncomplicated loyalty was the perfect antidote to the emotional complexity I had just escaped. My due date arrived and passed. The waiting became intense, an internal dialogue between me and the baby. Come when you're ready, little one. Your world is safe now. I read voraciously. Books on parenting, books on history, even the occasional frivolous novel, anything to occupy the hours. But every 20 minutes, my hands would instinctively rest on my belly, feeling the heavy, beautiful weight of completion. It began at 3 a.m, a sudden sharp ache that was unmistakable. Not the practice contractions, but the real demanding force of life starting its final push. I sat up in the futon, took a deep, measured breath, and smiled in the dark. He's coming. I immediately called Kate. Her voice was groggy, but instantly alert. Start timing them, love. I'm leaving now. By the time Kate arrived, smelling faintly of coffee and urgency, my contractions were coming every 10 minutes. We drove to the hospital through the quiet, sleeping streets of West London. The hospital room was bright, clinical, and reassuringly impersonal. The labor was long, relentless, and intensely internal. I leaned heavily on the lessons of the past few months: control, focus, and a fierce refusal to surrender to pain. I didn't scream or thrash. I focused on the rhythm, the building wave, the crest, the receding relief. Kate was a silent, indispensable presence, holding my hand, offering sips of water, and occasionally cracking a dry joke to break the tension. There were moments, long hours into the labor, when the pain became a physical, raging entity that threatened to engulf me. In those moments, I closed my eyes and focused on the why. This pain was not destructive. It was productive. It was a means to an end. It was the absolute opposite of the quiet, corrosive pain of betrayal. This was honest. This was earning my new life. I remembered Ethan's face in the Manchester apartment. Annoyed, distant, demanding silence. I remembered my father's empty chair at the dinner table. And I pushed harder, not just against the physical force, but against the legacy of abandonment. My son will know strength. After 14 hours, the end came swiftly. The room was suddenly crowded with urgent, kind voices. I felt the final, demanding, unbearable pressure. I pushed one last time, a roar tearing from my throat that was not pain, but pure, primal release. And then, the sudden, impossible relief. The air in the room changed, thick with the scent of saline, sweat, and a new, clean life. A long, gasping cry split the air. They laid him immediately on my chest. He was tiny, warm, and slick, his skin pink, his tiny mouth open in a furious, demanding scream. His eyes, dark and enormous, searched my face. All the pain, all the fear, all the isolation of the last 9 months, it vanished in that instant. There was only this impossible, perfect weight on my chest. This furious, miraculous little boy. Kate was weeping silently by the bedside. "Oh, Chloe," she whispered. I looked down at the tiny, perfect hand clutching my breast. He was here. He was real. He was entirely, unequivocally mine. I named him Leo James Anderson, a name that meant lion, a name that commanded strength and light. I refused to give him Ethan's surname. He was an Anderson, carrying the name of the woman who fought for him, the woman who chose him over a comfortable lie. The first few weeks home in the Ealing flat were a blissful, overwhelming haze. Sleep deprivation became my new normal, but it was a voluntary exhaustion, tinged with a deep, existential joy. I rarely felt lonely. Leo's absolute dependence filled every corner of the small apartment, crowding out the space where sadness might have lingered. His tiny, demanding cries, his soft weight against my chest during late-night feedings, the sheer, intoxicating scent of his skin, it was all-consuming. I realized that Ethan had been right about one thing. I had cut him out, but in doing so, I hadn't just created a broken family. I had created a complete, perfectly self-contained unit. I was both mother and father, protector and provider. My love for Leo was not compensatory. It was definitive. It was the purest expression of the life I was meant to lead. The financial arrangement through Clara was tested early on. Ethan, through his lawyer, requested a copy of the birth certificate and the official naming document. I provided the information strictly through Clara, along with a single, small, high-resolution photograph of Leo, asleep in his yellow nursery, his face utterly serene. I included a final, personal note to Ethan, sent via Clara, ensuring it was legally documented as my last communication outside of a court order. Ethan, Leo. James Anderson was born on date. He is healthy and thriving. As per our agreement, I have established the Educational and Health Fund. The enclosed photo is for your information only. He is not available for visitation at this time. All future contact must adhere strictly to the terms set forth by our legal counsel, focused solely on Leo's welfare, which, at this stage, requires stability and calm. You were given a chance to prove commitment. Your choice of absence dictates the current reality. I hold no anger, only resolve. You gave me the opportunity to build a life free from falsehood, and for that, I am profoundly grateful. I will not let the legacy of abandonment define my son. I will define it. Goodbye, Ethan. I sealed the envelope, handed it to Clara's messenger, and watched it disappear. It was the final, definitive farewell to the 10 years of my life with Ethan. No explosion, no tears, no dramatic confrontation, just the clean, final click of a closed door. That evening, I sat in the rocking chair, Leo nestled against my shoulder, his small body heavy and warm. The sun was setting over the park, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. I looked down at my son's sleeping face. He was the end of my past, and the absolute beginning of my future. I whispered the truth to him, the truth that had taken me 9 months of fear, legal battles, and loneliness to fully understand. Your father's betrayal was the fire, my love. It burned down the cage I didn't even know I was trapped in. It returned your mother to herself, and that return is the greatest love story we will ever know. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his small breath against my neck. Tout s'est brisé ce jour-là à Manchester. Yes, everything shattered. Mais certaines ruines font naître des chemins nouveaux. Et ce chemin-là sera juste à nous deux. The path was indeed just for the two of us. Hard-won, fiercely protected, and entirely, gloriously real. My life was simple now, focused and true. I had traded the complicated misery of a lie for the simple, overwhelming joy of an honest life. I had everything. The first year of Leo's life was a testament to the fact that chaos and profound joy could coexist. Sleep was a myth, replaced by a permanent state of low-grade exhaustion, but every tired minute was filled with purpose. The small flat in Ealing, once just a sterile sanctuary, was now a vibrant, slightly messy home, rich with the honest, intoxicating scents of milk, baby powder, and the clean laundry I was constantly folding. Leo was a demanding, but intensely happy child. He had Ethan's warm hazel eyes, a fact that was initially a small, quiet shock, but quickly became irrelevant. Those eyes, once a reminder of betrayal, now only reflected the pure, unadulterated curiosity of a soul discovering the world. They were his eyes, carrying his future, not his father's past. My maternity leave was the busiest, most fulfilling period of my life. I learned to navigate the world on 3 hours of fractured sleep, to soothe a colicky baby with rhythmic bouncing, and to find endless fascination in a tiny hand grasping my finger. Motherhood was the ultimate definition of self-reliance. There was no one to hand the crying baby to at 3 a.m. It was just me, and I found, to my immense relief, that I was infinitely capable. My career, which I had fought so hard to secure, adapted to my new reality. My promotion was waiting, and I returned to work when Leo was 6 months old, opting for a flexible 3-day week initially. The financial independence I had fought for paid for a wonderful, kind nanny, a woman named Mrs. Davies, whose grandmotherly presence filled the flat with warmth and stability on the days I was in the city. The guilt of leaving Leo was real, but the knowledge that I was maintaining my hard-won freedom and building the financial foundation for his life was a powerful counterweight. I was more efficient at work than ever before. There was no room for wasted time, no space for office politics. My life had a fierce new editing principle. If it did not serve Leo or my professional stability, it was ruthlessly cut. My colleagues respected it. My CEO, who was juggling his own complicated family life, understood it implicitly. The corporate world, which had once felt like a stressful, necessary evil, was now a tool, a means to protect the purity of my home life. Ethan's presence in our lives remained a legal and financial abstraction. He never contacted me directly after I sent the final message. All communication flowed through Clara Vance. He regularly deposited the mandated funds into Leo's trust account and the small amount for maintenance. He received periodic, impersonal updates and photographs, always taken by Mrs. Davies and sent via Clara's office, showing Leo at 6 months, then 9, then a year. Always thriving, always smiling, always safe. The silence from him was the ultimate confirmation of his character. He hadn't fought for a relationship, he had fought to alleviate his guilt. Once the legal and financial terms were set, and I had ensured that he could not manipulate me or the child, he receded entirely. He chose the shame of absence over the effort of commitment. I had feared his return, his attempts to disrupt our peace. His silence was the greatest gift of stability he could have given us. Leo's first birthday arrived, a triumphant milestone. I threw a small party in the Ealing flat, inviting Kate, Mrs. Davies, and a couple of my closest colleagues. The yellow nursery was filled with balloons and the joyous, slightly chaotic sounds of a baby exploring a birthday cake. Leo, smeared with blue frosting, looked up at me and laughed, a delighted, unguarded sound that melted every lingering vestige of my past pain. As I watched him play, I held a glass of sparkling cider and felt Kate squeeze my arm. "You did it, Chloe," she whispered. "You absolutely smashed it. He's the happiest kid I've ever seen." Her validation was pure, uncomplicated love, not pity. I looked at the room, my flat, paid for, filled with my people, celebrating my son. The betrayal in Manchester was a memory as remote and irrelevant as a childhood illness. It had not defined me, it had clarified me. The biggest emotional shift came when Leo began to talk. His first word was mama, his second was Kate. His world was small, safe, and entirely centered on the fierce, dependable women who surrounded him. When he was 2, he started asking simple, innocent questions about the world. He pointed to a father pushing a buggy in the park. "Mama, where's my daddy?" The question arrived, not with the expected sting of pain, but with a quiet, prepared grace. I had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in my head. I knelt down, looked into his earnest hazel eyes, and spoke the truth, gently edited for his comprehension. "Daddy is a man who lives very far away, Leo. He made a choice to be a man who works very hard, and he is helping us by making sure we have everything we need. But you have me, and you have Auntie Kate, and you have Mrs. Davies. We are your family. We are the ones who are here every morning and every night, and we are everything you need." Leo, satisfied with the clear, direct answer, simply pointed to a passing dog and demanded, "Doggy!" The conversation was over. There was no inherited trauma, no paralyzing fear, only the simple, confident acceptance of his reality. I had broken the cycle. I had ensured that my son would not grow up in a world poisoned by lies, but in a world defined by the honesty and presence of the love he did receive. I realized then that my fear, the fear of becoming my mother, the fear of Leo repeating my childhood, was entirely baseless. I had built a new structure that was immune to my father's leaving and Ethan's betrayal. The key was not finding the right man, but being the right person, stable, present, and truthful. At the office, my relentless focus paid off again. I was promoted to Director of Strategy, a title that demanded more travel. This time, the travel was not a source of stress, but a new adventure. Leo was now happily adjusted to Mrs. Davies, and I took my promotion not as a burden, but as a challenge. My world was expanding, not shrinking. I traveled to Paris, to Dublin, to Berlin. In each hotel room, alone with my laptop, I would look out at the foreign city lights. I was a single mother, a successful executive, entirely free, beholden to no one but the wonderful, demanding boy waiting for me back in Ealing. The thought of Ethan, somewhere in London, living his own private, shallow life, was truly just a distant memory. His betrayal had been the cruelest act of kindness, forcing me onto the path I was always meant to walk, a path paved with my own achievements and defined by my own fierce love. Leo turned 3, a milestone that felt less like a birthday and more like a coronation. He was a curious, articulate child, full of an uninhibited joy that was infectious. His vocabulary expanded daily, always accompanied by a litany of questions about the functioning of the world. Questions I was determined to answer honestly and directly. His world was stable, predictable, and saturated with love from the women who formed his bedrock: Mama, Auntie Kate, and Mrs. Davies. The small flat in Ealing, which I had worried would feel cramped as Leo grew, became a model of efficient, intentional living. We had everything we needed and nothing more. This minimalism was a deliberate choice, an antidote to the consumerist, cluttered life I had shared with Ethan. My success at work, my director title demanding focus and international travel, was now something I integrated into my life, not something that defined it. The travel was thrilling, a necessary refueling of my spirit, and the return home to Ealing was always the truest reward. Ethan's communication continued its predictable pattern, silence punctuated by sterile, quarterly legal correspondence. Every 6 months, I would receive a short, formal request for a meeting, always framed in neutral, court-approved language, to establish a consistent parental relationship. I would consult with Clara, and every time, the answer was the same: not yet. Leo is establishing emotional security. Any disruption at this critical developmental stage would be detrimental. Clara's strategy was brilliant. Delay until Leo was old enough to process the truth without trauma. Ethan, unwilling to endure the lengthy and emotionally draining court battle that establishing visitation would require, would always retreat, unwilling to put in the immense, thankless effort of proving himself. His desire for a relationship with his son remained an intellectual wish, never translating into a practical, sustained effort. He remained the man who valued ease over commitment. One cold, bright Saturday, when Leo was 3.5, we went to the London Zoo with Kate. It was one of those perfect autumn days where the air was crisp and the sunlight was sharp. We were laughing, watching the antics of a pair of chimpanzees. When I saw him, Ethan, he was standing near the viewing rail, dressed in an expensive, tailored winter coat, looking older, a little heavier, and fundamentally detached. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman, impeccably styled, laughing brightly at something he said. She was strikingly beautiful, wearing the exact kind of high heels I had seen in that Manchester apartment years ago. She was holding his arm, possessively. It was the first time I had seen him in 4 years. The shock was minimal. I had built such an emotional firewall around him that seeing him was like observing a character in an old film, familiar, but utterly irrelevant to my current reality. Kate saw him too. Her hand immediately flew to my arm, a protective gesture. "Chloe, don't look. We can move." But I was already looking. My focus was not on Ethan, but on the woman and the cold, unfeeling exchange of laughter. The image confirmed what I had always known. He hadn't changed. He had simply replaced one commitment with another temporary escape. His life was still defined by surface value and emotional avoidance. Leo, completely oblivious, pointed at the chimps. "Mama, look, they're swinging." I looked down at my son. His warm hazel eyes, so like his father's, were shining with pure, honest excitement. He was holding my hand tightly, his small fingers woven securely with mine. He was real. Ethan was a shadow. I made a choice in that instant. No retreat. I would not let the sight of him force me to hide. I tightened my grip on Leo's hand and walked deliberately towards the next enclosure, walking right past Ethan, close enough for him to smell the scent of my clean, unadorned life. As we passed, Leo pulled my attention back to the exhibit. He started making a high-pitched, curious chimp sound. At the sound of Leo's voice, Ethan froze. His head snapped up. His eyes, the same hazel as Leo's, locked onto my face. It was the final, devastating confrontation, but it was silent, lasting only 3 seconds. In those seconds, he saw me, successful, composed, undeniably thriving. He saw Leo, a beautiful, confident boy whose hand was securely held by his mother. He saw the completeness of the world he had rejected. There was no annoyance this time, only a flash of raw, unadulterated loss, a recognition of the magnitude of the mistake he had made, not just in betraying me, but in abandoning this perfect, irreplaceable future. He opened his mouth, a silent, desperate sound forming on his lips. I didn't slow down. I didn't acknowledge him. I didn't break my gaze from Leo's happy face. I maintained my trajectory, my body a shield, my resolve an impenetrable force field. I had told him my final word years ago, and my life was living proof of that declaration. We walked past, leaving him standing there in the cold London autumn, the expensive coat and the beautiful woman nothing more than fragile props in his lonely play. We walked toward the open space of the park, toward the light, toward the future. When we were safely out of sight, Kate finally exhaled. Well, that was brutal and beautiful. I looked at her, and a slow, steady smile spread across my face. It was nothing, Kate. He is nothing. Leo tugged my hand. Mama, ice cream now? Ice cream now, I agreed, bending down to scoop him into my arms. The weight of his small, healthy body, a perfect, grounding joy. I held him tight, feeling the soft texture of his hair against my cheek. I looked up at the vast, indifferent London sky. The betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but it had ultimately set me free. It had taken away my heart for a moment, but it had given me this child, this strength, this fiercely independent life. I whispered the mantra one last time, not as a memory of pain, but as a statement of profound existential gratitude. Tout s'est brisé ce jour-là à Manchester. Mais certaines ruines font naître des chemins nouveaux, et ce chemin-là sera juste à nous deux. The chapter was closed. The woman I was became the woman I was meant to be. I was home,